My name is Kyle Thompson. I'm 26 years old, a guitarist, and well, let's just say my life's a bit of a mess. I used to believe music was my escape, my salvation, but lately it feels more like a curse. The band and I were on our last legs when we decided to come here, to the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. It wasn't just for inspiration, it was our last shot at saving our careers. The record label had made it clear one more flop and we were done. No more tours, no more albums, no more anything. So here we were, crammed into an old RV that doubled as our mobile recording studio, parked in the middle of nowhere. The forest stretched endlessly around us, dark, quiet, and unsettling. Diane Roberts, our lead singer and my ex-girlfriend, was sitting across from me in the RV. She was humming softly to herself, her voice as beautiful as ever, but weaker than I remembered. She said it was just strain from rehearsing too much, but I could tell something was off. Diane wasn't the type to admit when something was wrong. Eddie Vance, our drummer and unofficial manager, sat at the tiny table with a pile of papers spread out in front of him. He was always the practical one, trying to keep us from falling apart, but even he looked worried. "We've got 1 week," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "If we don't come up with something good, no, something great, it's over." I didn't say anything. What could I say? My head was pounding from last night's binge, too much booze, too much cocaine. My hands shook as I tuned my guitar, pretending I wasn't falling apart inside. The air in the RV felt heavy with tension. None of us wanted to admit how bad things had gotten. Our last album had bombed so hard that even our most loyal fans had given up on us. And now we were here, hoping that some creepy forest in the middle of nowhere would somehow spark the magic we'd lost. "Maybe we should take a break," Diane said softly. Her voice broke through the silence like a fragile thread. "Go for a walk or something," Eddie snorted. "A walk? In this place? Have you seen how creepy these woods are?" I glanced out the window at the twisted trees and thick underbrush. He wasn't wrong. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but Diane just smiled faintly and shrugged. "Sometimes you find inspiration in the strangest places," she said. I didn't argue. Honestly, I didn't have the energy to argue with anyone anymore. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I felt a strange sense of unease settle over me. Something about this place didn't feel right. But then again, nothing in my life felt right anymore. Little did I know that this trip would change everything for better or worse. That first night in the Pine Barrens was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has stopped breathing. I lay on the small, uncomfortable bed in the RV, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Eddie was snoring softly on the couch, and Diane was curled up in her bunk, her back turned to me. I don't know what time it was, maybe midnight, maybe later when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from inside the RV, it was outside, somewhere deep in the woods. It was music. At first I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But as I sat up and listened closer, it became clearer, a melody so hauntingly beautiful that it sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. The notes seemed to float through the air, soft and distant, yet somehow sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. No response. Eddie kept snoring, and Diane didn't move. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing my jacket and stepping outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I needed to find out where that music was coming from. The forest looked different at night. Darker, deeper, almost alive. The twisted branches of the trees seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers, and the shadows danced in strange patterns under the pale moonlight. But the music, it pulled me forward, like an invisible thread winding its way through the trees. I don't know how long I walked, or how far I went. Time felt strange out there, like it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was following that melody. It grew louder as I moved deeper into the woods, each note more perfect than the last. Then suddenly, it stopped. I froze in place, my breath hanging in the air like smoke. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. For a moment I thought about turning back, about running back to the safety of the RV and pretending none of this had happened. But then I saw something. A faint glow through the trees, like moonlight reflecting off water. My curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer until I found myself standing at the edge of a small lake, Echo Lake, as we'd seen on the map earlier that day. The surface of the water was perfectly still, like a sheet of glass. And then it happened again. The music started up once more, but this time it wasn't distant, it was all around me. It seemed to rise up from the lake itself, echoing through the trees and filling my head with its strange beauty. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stand there and listen as something deep inside me stirred, a feeling I hadn't had in years. Inspiration. When I finally stumbled back to the RV hours later, though it felt like minutes, I found Diane sitting at the table with her notebook open in front of her. "You heard it too," she said quietly, without looking up. I nodded, still catching my breath. "What? What was that?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she held up her notebook to show me what she'd been writing: lyrics. Beautiful lyrics that seemed to flow effortlessly across the page. "I don't know," she said finally. "But whatever it is, it's helping." We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. Something had changed that night. Something we didn't understand yet, but couldn't ignore. As I lay back down in bed, clutching my guitar like a lifeline, one thought kept running through my mind. Where did that music come from? And why did it feel like it was meant for us? The morning came too quickly. I hadn't slept much after what happened at the lake, and judging by the dark circles under Diane's eyes, neither had she. Eddie, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. He was already up, making coffee and flipping through a stack of papers like it was just another day. "You guys look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a smirk, handing me a mug of coffee. I didn't answer. Diane and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us brought up the music. Not yet. It felt too strange to explain, like saying it out loud would make it less real, or maybe too real. By mid-morning, we decided to drive into town to stock up on supplies. Leeds Point wasn't much of a town, just a few old buildings, a gas station, and a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 50s. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else and strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. We pulled into the gas station first. The man behind the counter was older, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His name tag read Carl *, and he watched us closely as we grabbed snacks and drinks. "You folks camping out in the Barrens?" he asked as we brought our stuff to the counter. "Something like that," Eddie replied casually. "We're working on an album." Carl raised an eyebrow. "Musicians, huh? You know about this place, don't you?" Eddie chuckled nervously. "What do you mean?" "The Pine Barrens," Carl said, leaning forward slightly. "It's not just trees and trails out there. People've been disappearing in these woods for centuries. Some say it's the Jersey Devil." I froze at his words. The Jersey Devil? I'd heard stories about it growing up. A creature with wings and hooves that supposedly haunted these woods, but I'd always thought it was just a local legend. Carl must have noticed my reaction because he gave me a knowing look. "You hear anything strange out there last night?" he asked. Diane opened her mouth to say something, but Eddie cut her off with a laugh. "Nah, just crickets and wind," he said quickly, paying for our stuff and steering us toward the door. As we walked back to the RV, Diane whispered to me, "Why didn't you say anything?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It just didn't feel right." We were about to climb back into the RV when another car pulled up, a police cruiser this time. A tall man in his 50s stepped out, wearing a sheriff's uniform and a serious expression. His badge read Morgan Hayes *. "You folks staying out in the Barrens?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Eddie nodded. "Yeah, we're working on some music." The sheriff studied us for a moment before nodding slowly. "Be careful out there," he said. "We've had some incidents lately." "What kind of incidents?" Diane asked. "Disappearances," Hayes replied bluntly. "Hikers, campers, even some locals who should have known better." He paused before adding, "If you hear or see anything unusual, let me know." With that, he tipped his hat and got back into his car, leaving us standing there in uneasy silence. Back on the road, none of us spoke for a while. The tension in the RV was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Eddie broke the silence. "Look," he said firmly, "we're here to work on this album, not get caught up in ghost stories or whatever that guy was talking about." But as we drove deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that Carl and Sheriff Hayes knew something we didn't, something they weren't telling us. That night, as we set up our recording equipment in the RV, Diane's voice sounded stronger than it had in weeks, clearer, more powerful. It was like she'd found something she'd been missing for years. But when we played back her recording later, there was something else underneath her voice. Something faint but unmistakable. Another voice singing along with her, a voice that wasn't human. The second night in the Pine Barrens felt heavier, darker somehow. The air was colder, and the silence outside the RV seemed to press against the windows like an invisible weight. None of us talked much after dinner. Diane sat at the table, scribbling lyrics in her notebook, while Eddie tinkered with the recording equipment. I just sat on the couch, strumming my guitar softly, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't long before it started again. The music. This time it was louder, clearer, and closer. It drifted through the air like a ghostly lullaby, wrapping itself around us and pulling at something deep inside. Diane froze mid-sentence, her pen hovering over the page. Eddie looked up from his equipment, his brow furrowed. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked. Diane and I nodded silently. "It's coming from the woods," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Eddie stood up and grabbed his jacket. "I'm gonna check it out." "Wait," Diane said quickly. "We don't know what's out there. It's just music." Eddie replied with a shrug. "Probably some locals messing around or something." He opened the door and stepped outside before either of us could stop him. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing a flashlight and following him. Diane stayed behind, looking worried but not saying anything. As I stepped into the cold night air, I could still hear the music, soft and haunting, like it was calling to us. "Eddie," I called out, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't reach far. The forest seemed endless, its shadows shifting with every step I took. "I'm over here." Eddie's voice called back from somewhere ahead. I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush, until I found him standing in a small clearing. He was staring into the distance, his face pale and his eyes wide. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed wordlessly towards something on the ground, a jacket. It was old and tattered, covered in strange burn marks that didn't make any sense. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. "Let's go back," I said quickly. "This doesn't feel right." But Eddie didn't move. He just kept staring into the trees like he was in some kind of trance. The music grew louder, more urgent, wrapping itself around us like a living thing. "Eddie," I shouted, grabbing his arm and shaking him. That seemed to snap him out of it, and he blinked a few times before nodding slowly. Yeah, let's go," he muttered. We turned back toward the RV, but something felt off, like we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race faster. By the time we reached the RV, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the door. Diane was waiting for us inside, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" she asked as we stumbled inside. I didn't know how to explain it, how to put into words what we'd seen and felt out there. So I just shook my head and said, "Nothing. We didn't see anything." But that wasn't true. Later that night, as we replayed some of our recordings from earlier in the day, we heard something that made my blood run cold. Eddie's voice screaming in the distance, mixed with another sound that wasn't human at all. It was low and guttural, like some kind of growl or chant, or both. The thing is, none of us remembered hearing those screams while we were recording, and when we checked our equipment, it had been turned off at the time. The next morning, Eddie was gone. I woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the RV windows, and immediately felt something was wrong. The air inside felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. Diane was sitting at the table, her notebook closed for once, staring blankly at the door. "Where's Eddie?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. She shook her head. I don't know. He wasn't here when I woke up. Panic bubbled up in my chest. After what happened last night, the music, the screams, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to him. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and stepped outside, ignoring Diane's protests to stay put. The forest was eerily quiet again, but this time it felt different. Wrong. The trees seemed darker somehow, their twisted branches casting long shadows across the ground. I called Eddie's name over and over as I wandered through the woods, but there was no answer, just silence. And then I found it, his jacket. It was lying on the ground in the same clearing we'd been in last night, but now it looked even worse. The burn marks were larger, almost like something had melted parts of it. My stomach turned as I picked it up and realized there were dark stains on it. Blood. I stumbled back to the RV, my heart racing. Diane was waiting for me at the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Did you find him? She asked. I shook my head, holding up the jacket. Just this. Her face fell, and she sank into one of the chairs, burying her face in her hands. What's happening to us? She whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something out there wasn't right, and Eddie was caught in the middle of it. Hours passed with no sign of him. We didn't know what to do, whether to call the police or keep waiting. But then, just as the sun began to set, he came back. The door swung open suddenly, and there he was. Eddie, standing in the doorway like nothing had happened. He looked tired but otherwise fine, his clothes clean and his face calm. Where were you? Diane asked immediately, rushing toward him. Got lost, he said simply, shrugging like it wasn't a big deal. Spent the night in some old cabin out in the woods. Something about his tone felt off. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Too casual, too calm for someone who'd been missing all day. And then there was his face. It looked normal at first glance, but when I stared longer, I noticed something strange. His eyes were different, darker somehow, like they didn't quite belong to him anymore. Diane didn't seem to notice. She was too relieved he was back. But as Eddie sat down at his drum kit and started playing softly, I couldn't stop watching him. His drumming sounded wrong. The rhythms were too fast, too perfect, like something no human should be able to do. Later that night, Diane pulled me aside while Eddie was outside smoking a cigarette. Something's wrong, she whispered urgently. Have you noticed? I nodded slowly. He's different. She bit her lip nervously before glancing toward the window where Eddie stood outside under the moonlight. Kyle, she said quietly, he doesn't have a reflection. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. At first, I thought she must be mistaken, that maybe it was just a trick of the light or her imagination, but when I looked out at him myself, she was right. The moonlight reflected off everything, the RV windows, Diane's face behind me, but not Eddie's. It was like he wasn't really there at all. That night, as we tried to sleep with Eddie sitting silently at the table like a shadow that wouldn't leave us alone, I couldn't shake one thought. Whatever came back from those woods, it wasn't Eddie. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. Eddie, or whatever he was now, sat at the table, staring at nothing in particular. He didn't talk much, didn't even seem tired. It was like he was waiting for something. Diane sat across from me on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest. She hadn't said a word since she pointed out Eddie's lack of a reflection. I could tell she was scared, was I, but neither of us knew what to do. Around midnight, there was a knock on the RV door. We froze. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? Eddie didn't move, didn't even react, which made it feel even creepier. Slowly, I got up and opened the door. It was Sheriff Hayes. Sorry to bother you so late, he said, his voice low and calm, but I figured you might want to see this. He held up a folder stuffed with old papers and photographs. His face was serious, but there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't just here as a concerned cop. What is it? I asked cautiously. Mind if I come in? He replied. I glanced back at Diane, who nodded hesitantly, and stepped aside to let him in. He sat down at the table across from Eddie, who still hadn't said a word or even looked up. Hayes opened the folder and spread its contents on the table. There were old black and white photos of musicians, bands, solo artists, even orchestras and newspaper clippings about their disappearances. Some of the articles were decades old, others were more recent. These people all came to the Pine Barrens, Hayes said quietly. Most of them were musicians like you. They came here looking for inspiration, and they found it. But they never left. Diane leaned forward, her eyes scanning the photos and headlines. What happened to them? She whispered. Hayes hesitated before answering. Some were never found. Others, well, let's just say what we did find wasn't pretty. I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked at one of the photos, a band from the 1970s standing in front of an RV that looked eerily similar to ours. The caption read, "Thud Shin missing since 1978. Asterisk. What does this have to do with us?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew. Hayes sighed and pulled out another piece of paper, a handwritten journal entry from what looked like the 1800s. It mentioned the Leeds family, who had lived in this area centuries ago. According to legend, they practiced dark rituals involving music, rituals meant to summon something from beyond. "The Jersey Devil," Diane murmured, her voice barely audible. Hayes nodded grimly. "That's what people call it now. But whatever it is, it feeds on creativity. Music, art, ideas. It draws people in with promises of inspiration and takes everything from them." I glanced at Eddie, who was still sitting silently at the table. His face was blank, but there was something wrong with his expression, like it didn't quite fit him anymore. "What about him?" I asked quietly, nodding toward Eddie. Hayes looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes, it doesn't take people all at once," he said carefully. "Sometimes it uses them first." Diane gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. My stomach twisted into knots as Hayes continued. "If you're smart," he said firmly, "you'll leave tonight. Forget your album, forget everything you've heard here, and just go." "But what about Eddie?" Diane asked desperately. Hayes didn't answer right away. He just stood up and gathered his papers back into the folder. "Some things can't be saved," he said finally, before stepping out into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving us alone with Eddie and the suffocating silence that followed his warning. Diane turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Kyle, what are we going to do?" I didn't know how to answer her because deep down, I wasn't sure there was anything we could do. The next morning, the RV felt suffocating. The air inside was heavy, and the tension between Diane and me was unbearable. Eddie, or whatever he had become, was still with us, but he barely spoke. He just sat there, drumming his fingers on the table in a strange rhythmic pattern that didn't feel human. Diane and I decided we couldn't stay cooped up any longer. We needed answers. So we left Eddie behind in the RV and headed toward the one place we'd been avoiding since we arrived, the ruins of the Leeds mansion. The mansion wasn't far from where we were parked, but the walk through the woods felt endless. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our boots and our own nervous breathing. When we finally reached the mansion, it was worse than I'd imagined. The place was a crumbling skeleton of what must have once been a grand Victorian home. Vines snaked up the walls and the windows were shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets. The air around it felt colder, heavier, like the forest itself didn't want us there. "We shouldn't be here," Diane whispered, clutching my arm. "We have to," I said, though my voice shook as much as hurt. We stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The interior was a mess of broken furniture, rotting wood, and graffiti left by thrill-seeking teenagers over the years. But as we moved deeper into the house, we found something that didn't belong, something that made my blood run cold. A room filled with instruments. They were everywhere. Violins, guitars, drums, all of them old and broken, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention most were the pieces scattered on a long table in the center of the room. Vocal cords preserved in jars, strings made from what looked like human hair, and bones carved into flutes. "Oh my God," Diane whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. This is sick." I felt like I was going to be sick myself. This wasn't just a collection, it was a workshop. Someone had been using these parts to make instruments out of people. And then we saw it. The thing that confirmed our worst fears. In the corner of the room was Eddie's drum kit, or what was left of it. The drums were smashed to pieces, covered in blood and something black that looked like tar. Scattered around it were scraps of clothing that matched what Eddie had been wearing when he disappeared into the woods 2 nights ago. "No," Diane said shakily, backing away. No. I wanted to tell her it wasn't what it looked like, that there had to be some other explanation, but I couldn't lie to her. Not when I felt it too. The overwhelming sense that whatever had come back to us wasn't Eddie at all. We turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A staircase leading down into what must have been the mansion's basement. A faint light flickered at the bottom, like a candle struggling to stay lit. "Kyle," Diane said urgently, pulling at my arm. "We need to go." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something about that light drew me in, just like the music had 2 nights ago. Against my better judgment, I started down the stairs. The basement was worse than anything upstairs. Dark and damp, with walls covered in strange symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room was an altar made of blackened wood, surrounded by more jars filled with preserved body parts, fingers, eyes, ears. And there, lying on top of the altar like some kind of offering, was Eddie, or at least what was left of him. His body was mutilated beyond recognition, his chest torn open and his vocal cords ripped out. His hands were gone too, replaced by crude wooden stumps attached to his wrists with wire. It looked like someone or something had tried to turn him into one of their instruments. I stumbled back up the stairs in horror, grabbing Diane's hand and pulling her with me as I ran out of that cursed house as fast as I could. When we finally made it back to the RV, Eddie, or whatever had been pretending to be him, was gone. But his drumming, his impossible drumming, still echoed faintly in my ears. That night, the storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, and rain pounded against the RV's roof like a frantic drumbeat. Diane and I sat inside, too shaken to speak. The air felt electric, charged with something we couldn't see but could feel deep in our bones. Every flash of lightning lit up the forest outside, casting twisted shadows that danced like they were alive. Eddie was still gone, or whatever had been pretending to be him, but somehow, I knew he wasn't far. The drumming I'd heard in my head since we left the mansion hadn't stopped. It was faint, but constant, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. Diane broke the silence first. "Kyle," she whispered, her voice trembling. What if we're next?" I didn't know how to answer her because I was thinking the same thing. Whatever had taken Eddie wasn't done with us yet. I could feel it. And then we heard it. The music. It started softly, just like before, a haunting melody that seemed to rise from the storm itself. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right outside the RV. Diane grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't go out there," she pleaded. But I couldn't ignore it. The pull was too strong, too overwhelming. It wasn't just music. It was something more, something alive. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The storm hit me like a wall as I stepped outside, the rain soaking me instantly. The music grew louder, wrapping around me like an invisible hand guiding me forward. Diane called after me, but her voice was drowned out by the wind and thunder. I didn't have to go far to find it. In a clearing just beyond the RV stood something that made my blood run cold. At first, it looked like a man, tall and thin with long limbs and a hunched posture. But as lightning flashed across the sky, I saw its true form. It wasn't human. Its body was twisted and unnatural, covered in dark, leathery skin that glistened in the rain. Large wings folded against its back like those of a bat, and its face was the worst part. It had long, sharp features, like a goat's skull stretched over something vaguely human, and its eyes glowed red in the darkness. The Jersey Devil. It stood there in the storm, staring at me with those burning eyes as its mouth moved in time with the music that filled the air. But it wasn't singing, it was speaking directly into my mind. "Your music is mine," it said in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but something deeper, something that echoed inside my skull. I couldn't move, couldn't look away as it stepped closer. Its wings unfurled slightly, casting an enormous shadow over me even in the darkness. "You've tasted my gift," it continued. "The inspiration you seek, it comes from me." I realized then what it meant. The melodies we'd heard, the lyrics Diane had written so effortlessly, they weren't ours at all, they were asterisk. Hugh's asterisk. It had been feeding us its creations all along, drawing us deeper into its trap. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out through the lump in my throat. It tilted its head slightly, almost curiously. "Your talent," it said simply. "Your creativity sustains me." Behind me, I heard Diane scream as she stumbled out of the RV into the storm. She froze when she saw it, the creature standing there in all its horrific glory, but instead of running back inside, she stepped forward. "No," I shouted, grabbing her arm to stop her, but she shook her head and looked at me with tears streaming down her face, tears that weren't just from fear but from something deeper. "Kyle," she whispered brokenly, "I'm dying anyway." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her in shock as she continued. "I have cancer," she said quietly. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to give up on this album." She turned back toward the creature and took another step forward despite my protests. The Jersey Devil spread its wings fully now, towering over us both as lightning lit up the clearing once more. Diane held her ground even as it loomed closer. "Take me," she said firmly. "Leave him alone." "No," I shouted again, trying to pull her back, but it was too late. The creature reached out with one long clawed hand and touched her forehead gently, almost tenderly, before pulling her into its grasp. She didn't scream or struggle. She just looked back at me one last time with a sad smile before disappearing into the storm along with it. The music stopped instantly, and just like that, they were gone. I fell to my knees in the mud and rain, screaming her name into the empty night until my throat burned and my voice gave out completely. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was worse. The forest felt dead, like all the life had been drained from it. I sat in the RV, soaked to the bone and shaking, staring at the empty space where Diane had been just hours ago. Her voice, her smile, her presence, they were gone. And I couldn't stop replaying her last words in my head. "Fawn dying anyway." I didn't know how long I sat there before I heard it again. The faint sound of drumming. It wasn't coming from inside the RV. It was outside, somewhere deep in the woods, Eddie, or whatever was left of him. I didn't want to go out there again. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me, but I couldn't stay in the RV either. Every inch of this place felt wrong now, like it was closing in on me. So I grabbed my guitar and a flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched. The drumming grew louder as I moved deeper into the woods, each beat pulling me forward like a magnet. And then I saw them, Eddie and Sheriff Hayes. They were standing in another clearing, their faces blank and their movements stiff like puppets on strings. Eddie's hands moved over a makeshift drum kit made of old tree stumps and rocks, his rhythms impossibly fast and precise. Hayes stood beside him, holding a notebook filled with sheet music that looked ancient, like something out of another century. They didn't look human anymore. Eddie's skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes completely black. Hayes' face was twisted into a permanent grimace, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of the notebook. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as they turned toward me in perfect unison. "You shouldn't have come back," Hayes said in a voice that wasn't his own. It was deeper, colder, like it came from somewhere far away. "What do you want from me?" I asked shakily. Eddie stopped drumming and stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. "You've already given us what we need," he said. Or rather, something inside him said through his mouth. "Your music is ours now." I realized then what they meant. The recordings we'd made over the past few days weren't just songs anymore. They were something else entirely, something tainted by whatever had been haunting these woods. I turned to run, but Hayes grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You can't leave," he said firmly. "Not until you bring us more." "More what?" I shouted, struggling against his grip. "More talent," he replied simply. More souls. It hit me then. The Jersey Devil wasn't just feeding on us. It wanted us to bring others here too. It wanted us to lure more musicians into its trap so it could keep feeding forever. No, I said angrily, yanking my arm free. I won't do it. Eddie stepped closer now, his black eyes staring into mine as he spoke again. You don't have a choice. But Diane's sacrifice flashed in my mind, her bravery, her final act to save me, and it gave me the strength I needed to fight back. I swung my guitar at Hayes with all my strength, knocking him to the ground before turning and running as fast as I could through the trees. The drumming started up again behind me, louder and faster this time, like it was chasing me, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached the RV, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were about to give out. I jumped inside and slammed the door shut behind me before grabbing the keys and starting the engine. The RV roared to life, and I floored it down the narrow dirt road that led out of the barrens. The trees blurred past me as I drove faster than I ever had before, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. But even as I escaped, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever had happened here would follow me wherever I went. Months have passed since I escaped the Pine Barrens, but it feels like I never really left. The memories of that place, the music, Diane's sacrifice, Eddie's transformation are with me every single day. They haunt me like shadows I can't outrun. I thought I could move on, but the world won't let me. The album we recorded in those woods, the one filled with melodies that weren't ours, was released posthumously under Diane's name. Eddie and Diane were gone, but their voices lived on in those tracks, and the worst part, it was a hit. A massive hit. People couldn't get enough of it. They said it was unlike anything they'd ever heard. Haunting, beautiful, hypnotic. The songs climbed the charts faster than anything I'd ever been part of before, and suddenly I was famous. But fame didn't feel like success. It felt like a curse. The fans were the strangest part. They weren't just listening to the music. They were obsessed with it. Some claimed it changed their lives, while others said they couldn't stop hearing it even when they weren't playing it. A few even started showing up at my door, begging me to take them to the place where the inspiration came from. They wanted to go to the Pine Barrens. At first I told them no. I told them it wasn't real, that the stories were just myths and legends, but they didn't believe me. And as time went on, I started to wonder if maybe they were right to want what I had seen. Because the truth is, I haven't stopped hearing the music either. It's always there, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. A melody that whispers to me when I'm alone. Sometimes it feels like it's calling me back to the woods, and other times it feels like it's already inside me, growing stronger with every passing day. Last week, I found myself driving toward New Jersey without even realizing it. The RV was long gone. I sold it after everything happened, but my car felt like it had a mind of its own, pulling me toward Leeds Point like a magnet. I stopped myself before I got there, but barely. And now, as I sit here staring at my guitar, the same one I used in those cursed woods, I know what's coming next. The Jersey Devil isn't done with me. It wants more souls, more talent, more creativity to feed on. And whether I like it or not, I'm its messenger now. The music we made in those woods wasn't just ours, it was its asterisk. And now that music is spreading across the world like a virus, infecting everyone who hears it. Tonight there's a knock at my door. When I open it, there's a young musician standing there, a girl no older than 20 with wide eyes and a hopeful smile. She tells me she's a fan of the album and asks if I can show her where we recorded it. I want to tell her no, to slam the door and warn her to stay far away from that place, but instead I find myself nodding slowly. Sure, I say quietly. I'll take you. As she steps inside and starts asking questions about the Pine Barrens, I feel the music rising again in my head, soft and haunting, pulling me forward like it always does. And deep down, I know this is how it starts again. My name is Lisa Patterson. I was 15 years old the summer my family decided to take our first real vacation. It was 1956. and we were heading to Shadow Hollow Campground near Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. My dad, James, said it was time for us to relax and be a family again. He'd been distant ever since the war, and my mom, Helen, thought maybe this trip would help him heal. We had just bought a shiny 1954 Airstream cruiser, a big deal for us after years of saving every penny. Dad was proud of it, though he didn't show much emotion. He rarely did. My older brother Michael wasn't thrilled about the trip. He was 17 and thought spending time with family was lame. I didn't mind. I loved reading books about folklore and history, and Mammoth Cave had plenty of both. When we arrived at the campground, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the shadows cast by the trees seemed longer than they should have been. It was late afternoon, and the sunlight made everything look golden, but something about those shadows caught my attention. They seemed to move when no one else did. Dad parked the RV near a spot overlooking the valley. "This is perfect," he said, though his voice sounded hollow. Mom smiled and started unpacking, while Michael grumbled about how boring this place was going to be. I wandered off a little, curious about the area. The campground was quiet, too quiet for my liking. I noticed a few other families setting up their tents, but most of them seemed distracted or nervous. There were signs warning people not to enter certain areas near the caves. "Danger. Restricted access," they said in bold letters. As I stood there staring at the signs, I felt a chill run down my spine. When I turned around, my shadow didn't look quite right. It seemed darker than usual and almost alive. That first night at Shadow Hollow Campground was when things started to feel off. After dinner, we all settled into the RV. Mom and Dad were in their bed at the back. Michael had the small pull-out couch, and I was on the bunk above him. The campground was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of crickets or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those shadows I'd seen earlier. Something about them didn't feel right. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. That's when I heard it. A soft creaking sound, like footsteps on gravel. I leaned over the edge of my bunk and whispered, "Michael, did you hear that?" No response. I peeked down and saw his bed was empty. His blanket was tossed aside, and his shoes were gone. My heart sank. Michael had snuck out. I climbed down as quietly as I could and slipped on my sneakers. I didn't want to wake Mom or Dad. They'd be furious if they knew Michael had left. I stepped outside into the cool night air, shivering a little as I looked around. The campground was dark, with only a few dim lights near the bathrooms. Shadows stretched long across the ground, twisting and bending in ways that made me uneasy. "Michael," I called softly, not wanting to draw too much attention. No answer. I walked a little further, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I noticed something strange under our RV. The ground beneath it wasn't solid like it had been earlier. It looked soft, almost like wet sand, even though we were parked on gravel. There were odd patterns in the dirt, like swirls or claw marks. I crouched down to get a better look when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning quickly, I expected to see Michael, but it was Dad. He looked tired and worried, holding his own flashlight. "Lisa, what are you doing out here?" he asked in a hushed voice. "Michael's gone," I said. "I think he snuck out." Dad frowned and scanned the area with his flashlight. "Stay close to me," he said firmly. We walked together through the campground, calling Michael's name quietly so we wouldn't wake anyone else. As we passed by one of the restricted cave entrances, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something darting into the shadows. "Dad," I whispered, pointing toward the cave. He shook his head. "Stay away from there," he said sharply. "It's dangerous." We kept searching for what felt like forever until finally, we spotted Michael near a group of local teenagers by a campfire on the other side of the campground. He was laughing and joking like nothing was wrong. "Michael," Dad barked, his voice low but angry. Michael froze when he saw us. "What? It's not a big deal," he muttered. As we approached, "Get back to the RV," Dad said through gritted teeth. "Now." Michael rolled his eyes but followed us back without arguing too much. When we got inside, Mom was awake and waiting for us, her arms crossed and her face tight with worry. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," Michael said with a shrug. "I just wanted some fresh air." Dad didn't say anything. He just sat down heavily on the couch and rubbed his temples like he had a headache. Mom scolded Michael quietly while I climbed back into my bunk, still feeling uneasy. That night, I had a dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream at all. In it, I saw figures rising from the ground outside our RV. They didn't have faces, just smooth skin where their features should have been, and their bodies seemed to shimmer like heat waves on asphalt. They whispered in voices that sounded like wind through trees. "In wanted skin. We need shadows." I woke up with a start, my heart racing. The RV was silent except for Dad's soft snoring and Mom's steady breathing. But outside, through the thin walls of the RV, I thought I heard something faint, like soil shifting underfoot. The next morning, everything felt strange. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things that didn't sit right. The air was heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The shadows outside seemed sharper, darker than they should have been in the soft morning light. Even the birds sounded quieter, their songs distant and muffled. Mom suggested we take a trip into town to pick up some supplies and explore a bit. Dad agreed, though he still seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. Michael sulked, but came along anyway, probably because he didn't want to be left alone at the campground. I didn't say much. I couldn't stop thinking about my dream from the night before. We drove into town and stopped at a small place called Norton's General Store. It was an old building with peeling paint and a wooden sign that creaked in the breeze. Inside, it smelled like dust and dried herbs. Shelves were lined with everything from canned goods to handmade trinkets. Behind the counter stood an elderly man who introduced himself as Elijah Norton. He had pale skin that almost looked gray, and his eyes were sharp, like he could see right through you. But what struck me most was that he didn't have a shadow. I noticed it right away. There was nothing on the floor behind him, even though the light from the window should have cast one. "Morning," Elijah said in a deep, raspy voice. "Y'all must be staying at Shadow Hollow." Dad nodded. "Yeah, we're camping there for a few days." Elijah's expression didn't change, but I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Worry, maybe. "Be careful out there," he said slowly. "That land's older than most folks realize." "What do you mean?" Mom asked. Elijah leaned forward on the counter, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "They call it hollow ground for a reason," he said. "There are things under that earth that don't belong in our world." Michael snorted. "What? Like ghosts?" Elijah didn't laugh. He just stared at Michael for a long moment before turning his attention back to Dad. "If you're smart, you'll keep your family close after dark," he said. Then he reached under the counter, pulled out a small box filled with iron talismans, roughly shaped pieces of metal on leather cords. "Take these," he said, handing one to each of us. "They won't stop what's out there, but they might slow it down." Dad hesitated, but eventually took them, muttering something about local superstition. I slipped mine over my head right away. It felt cold against my skin, but oddly comforting. As we were leaving, Elijah called out to me specifically. "You're curious about things you shouldn't be," he said. "Be careful where your curiosity takes you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and followed my family out the door. Later that afternoon, we went on a guided tour of Mammoth Cave led by one of the park rangers. The caves were massive and beautiful, with stalactites hanging from the ceilings like chandeliers and underground rivers carving paths through the rock. But as we walked deeper into the tunnels, I started to feel uneasy again. The ranger talked about how indigenous people had used the caves thousands of years ago and how early settlers had mined them for saltpeter during the War of 1812. But he didn't mention anything about legends or warnings, nothing about shadowy figures or hollow ground. After the tour ended, I stayed behind for a moment to look at some carvings on the cave walls, ancient pictographs left by indigenous people long ago. They showed stick-like figures standing over others who were lying on the ground, or maybe sinking into it. The more I stared at them, the more they reminded me of my dream. When we got back to the RV that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The shadows outside seemed even darker now, stretching toward us like they were alive. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the carvings in the cave and what Elijah had said at the store. Something about it all felt connected, but I couldn't figure out how. After dinner, while Mom cleaned up and Dad tinkered with something outside, I sat on my bunk with my notebook, sketching the pictographs from memory. Michael was lying on the couch, flipping through a magazine. "You're obsessed," he said without looking up. "It's just some old drawings. You're making it weird." I ignored him and kept sketching. The figures in the carvings looked like they were pulling shadows from the people on the ground, or maybe they were giving shadows back. I wasn't sure, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. "Lisa," Mom called from outside, "can you help me for a minute?" I put down my notebook and stepped out of the RV. The air was cooler now, and the wind had picked up just enough to rustle the leaves. Mom was standing near the back of the RV, staring at the ground. "Look at this," she said, pointing. The gravel under our RV had shifted again, but this time it wasn't just soft, it looked like it had been churned up, like something had moved through it from below. The swirls and claw-like marks were back, but now there were deeper impressions that almost looked like handprints. "What do you think it is?" I asked nervously. Mom shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe an animal, but I've never seen anything like this before." Before we could say anything else, Dad came around the corner carrying his flashlight. "What's going on?" he asked. Mom showed him the marks in the ground, but he just frowned and muttered something about unstable soil. "It's nothing," he said firmly. "Don't worry about it." But I could tell he wasn't convinced. Later that evening, while Michael and Dad were securing the RV against the wind, I decided to explore a little on my own. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward one of the smaller caves near our campsite, the one with the restricted access sign. The entrance was narrow and partially hidden by bushes, but I managed to squeeze through without too much trouble. Inside it was quiet, eerily quiet, and colder than I expected. The walls were smooth in some places and jagged in others, like they'd been shaped by both nature and human hands. As I moved deeper into the cave, my flashlight beam caught something on the wall, more carvings. These were different from the ones in Mammoth Cave. They looked older and cruder, like they'd been scratched into the rock in a hurry. They showed figures without shadows standing over others who seemed to be sinking into the ground. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings and felt a chill run through me. It was almost as if the rock itself was alive, or maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Then I heard something, a faint whispering sound coming from deeper inside the cave. It wasn't words exactly, more like a soft rustling or murmuring that made my skin crawl. "Lisa," Mom's voice echoed from outside, snapping me out of my trance. I turned quickly and hurried back to the entrance, stumbling over loose rocks as I went. When I emerged into the open air, Mom was standing there with her arms crossed. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. "I just wanted to look around," I stammered. Mom sighed and shook her head. "It's not safe to wander off like that," she said. "Stay close to us from now on." I nodded but didn't say anything about what I'd seen or heard in the cave. As we walked back to the RV together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. And when we reached our campsite, I noticed something else. My shadow didn't look quite right again. It seemed thinner somehow, fainter than it should have been under the bright light of our lanterns. That night, the wind howled outside the RV, making it creak and groan like an old ship at sea. Mom said it was just a storm rolling in, but when I peeked out the window, the sky was clear. There were no clouds, no rain, just that strange, restless wind. We all tried to settle in for the night. Dad sat at the small table with a map spread out in front of him, muttering about finding a new route to leave early. Michael was lying on the couch with his headphones on, pretending not to care about anything. Mom was reading a book, though I could tell by the way she kept glancing out the window that she was on edge too. I stayed in my bunk, clutching the iron talisman Elijah had given me. It felt heavier than it had earlier, like it was pulling me down. I couldn't stop thinking about the carvings in the cave and how my shadow had looked thinner when we got back. Something wasn't right here, something deep and old and wrong. Around midnight, I finally started to drift off to sleep. That's when I heard it, a low rumbling sound coming from beneath us. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my eyes snap open. "Did anyone else hear that?" I whispered. No one answered. I leaned over the edge of my bunk and saw that Michael's bed was empty again. His blanket was crumpled on the floor, and his shoes were gone. "Michael?" I called softly. Still no answer. I climbed down as quietly as I could and shook Dad awake. "Michael's gone," I whispered urgently. Dad's eyes flew open, and he sat up immediately. "What do you mean he's gone?" he asked, his voice low but tense. "I don't know," I said. "He's not in his bed." Dad grabbed his flashlight and motioned for me to stay behind, but I followed him anyway. We stepped outside into the cold night air, and that's when we saw it. The ground beneath the RV had sunk even further. The gravel was completely gone now, replaced by soft, dark soil that looked like it had been freshly dug up. "Michael," Dad called out into the darkness. The only response was the wind whistling through the trees. We started searching around the campsite, our flashlights cutting through the shadows. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter everything became. Even the wind seemed to die down, leaving only an eerie silence. Then we found something, a single shoe lying near one of the sinkholes that had appeared earlier in the day. It was Michael's. "Shames." Mom's voice rang out from behind us, sharp with panic. She came running toward us with her own flashlight in hand. "Something's happening to the RV," she said breathlessly. We hurried back to find Mom standing near the back of the RV, pointing at its side. Long scratches ran down the metal surface, as if something with claws had tried to tear its way inside. The windows were fogged up from the inside, even though none of us had been inside for a while. And then we heard it, a muffled scream coming from below us. "Michael!" Dad shouted, dropping to his knees and pressing his ear against the ground. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The scream came again, fainter this time, and then there was nothing but silence. "We have to get him out," Dad said urgently, grabbing a shovel from where it was propped against a tree. But before he could start digging, something happened that made all of us stop in our tracks. Shadows began moving across the ground, long and thin and completely separate from anything they should have been attached to. They slithered toward us like living things, curling around our feet and reaching for our legs. "Get inside," Dad yelled, pulling me toward the RV. We scrambled inside and slammed the door shut just as one of those shadows reached up and pressed itself against the window. It didn't look like a normal shadow. It shimmered faintly in the lantern light, its edges shifting like smoke. "What is that?" Mom whispered, clutching her iron talisman tightly. None of us had an answer. For hours we stayed huddled together in silence as those shadows moved around outside. Every so often we'd hear faint scratching sounds on the walls or feel a low rumble beneath our feet, and then, just before dawn, it all stopped. The shadows disappeared as quickly as they'd come, leaving nothing behind but an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. But Michael didn't come back. The morning after Michael disappeared, the air felt heavier than ever. None of us had slept. Mom sat at the small table in the RV, staring blankly at her hands, her iron talisman dangling from her neck. Dad was outside, pacing back and forth, his face pale and drawn. I stayed in my bunk, clutching my sketchbook and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Where could he have gone? Mom whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Dad came back inside, his jaw tight. "We're going to find him," he said firmly. "I'll go back to the general store and talk to that man, Elijah. He knows something." "I'm coming with you," Mom said, standing up. "No," Dad said quickly. "You stay here with Lisa. I don't want her alone." Mom hesitated, but finally nodded. Dad grabbed his flashlight and headed out toward the truck. After he left, the RV felt too quiet. The wind had stopped completely, and even the birds were silent. It was like the whole campground was holding its breath. "Mom," I said softly, "do you think Michael's okay?" She turned to me. her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "We're going to find him," she said. "Your dad will figure this out." But I wasn't so sure. Something about this place felt wrong, like it was alive and didn't want us here. I decided to distract myself by looking through my sketches again. As I flipped through the pages, something caught my eye, a detail I hadn't noticed before. In one of the carvings I'd drawn from the cave, there was a figure standing over another figure lying on the ground. The standing figure had no shadow. My heart skipped a beat as I remembered Elijah's words. "Mount, they call it hollow ground for a reason." Asterisk. Before I could say anything to Mom, we heard a sound outside, a faint rustling like leaves being dragged across the ground. Mom froze. "Stay here," she said firmly, grabbing a flashlight and stepping outside. "Wait." I called after her, but she was already gone. I climbed down from my bunk and peeked out the window. Mom was standing near the back of the RV, shining her flashlight at something on the ground. Her shadow stretched long behind her in the early morning light, but then I saw it flicker, like it wasn't attached to her anymore. "Mom," I shouted, throwing open the door and running outside. She turned around just as something shot up from the ground, a pale, elongated hand with too many fingers. It grabbed her ankle and yanked her down before she could even scream. I ran toward her without thinking, but as soon as I got close, another hand burst out of the soil in front of me. It clawed at my legs, but I jumped back just in time. "Lisa, get inside," Mom screamed as she struggled against whatever was pulling her down. I hesitated for a split second before running back into the RV and slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. Through the window, I saw Mom fighting with everything she had, kicking at those horrible hands as they dragged her toward one of the sinkholes near our campsite. Her shadow flickered wildly on the ground beside her. It looked thinner now, almost transparent. And then, she was gone. The ground closed up behind her like nothing had happened. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. What had just happened? Where had she gone? And what were those things? Before I could even catch my breath, there was another sound. A low rumble coming from beneath the RV. The floor trembled slightly under my feet. I backed away slowly, clutching my iron talisman like it was a lifeline. The rumbling grew louder until suddenly, silence. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, a faint voice calling my name from somewhere deep below. "Lisa." It sounded like Michael. I couldn't move. My brother's voice, soft, distant, and broken, was calling my name from somewhere beneath the ground. "Lisa." It didn't sound right. It was Michael's voice, but it was hollow, like it was coming through a long tunnel, warped and stretched. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. "Mom," I whispered into the silence. "Michael." No answer. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and clutched the iron talisman around my neck. My hands were trembling so badly that the flashlight beam wobbled as I pointed it toward the floor. The RV felt too small, too quiet, like the walls were closing in on me. Then I heard footsteps outside, heavy, hurried footsteps. "Dad," I cried, running to the door and flinging it open. It was him. He looked pale and frantic, his shirt streaked with dirt and sweat. "Where's your mom?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. I couldn't answer. My throat felt like it had closed up. I just pointed toward the sinkhole where she'd been pulled under. Dad's face crumpled for a moment, but then he straightened up, his jaw set in determination. "We're going to get them back," he said firmly. "Both of them." "How?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Elijah," Dad said quickly. "He knows what's happening here." We jumped into the truck and sped back to Norton's General Store. The drive felt like a blur, trees whipping past us as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the road that seemed to reach for us as we drove by. When we arrived at the store, Elijah was waiting for us on the porch like he'd known we were coming. His shadowless figure stood out against the bright morning light, making my stomach twist into knots all over again. "They've taken them," Dad said without preamble as he climbed out of the truck. "My wife and son, They're gone. Elijah nodded slowly, his expression grim but unsurprised. The Hollow Men, he said quietly. They've been here longer than anyone can remember, longer than this land has had a name. What do they want? I asked, stepping closer despite my fear. They feed on shadows, Elijah explained, his voice low and steady. Shadows are more than just shapes on the ground. They're a part of us, tied to our souls. The Hollow Men take them to grow stronger, to escape their prison underground. Prison? Dad asked sharply. Elijah nodded again. A long time ago, centuries before settlers came here, the indigenous people sealed them away using an ancient ritual. But that seal is weakening now. He looked at me then, his sharp eyes piercing right through me. They need 7 shadows to break free completely. How do we stop them? Dad demanded. Elijah hesitated before reaching behind the counter and pulling out an old leather-bound book filled with faded drawings and symbols. He flipped through it until he found what he was looking for, a page showing a diagram of a cave with markings around its entrance. There's a seal, deep underground, he said, tapping the page with one finger. If you can find it and restore it before they take their 7th shadow, you might be able to trap them again. How do we restore it? I asked. Elijah's face darkened at that question, but he didn't answer right away. Finally, he said softly, "The seal requires a sacrifice, a willing soul to bind it." Dad stiffened beside me, but neither of us said anything. "You'll need these," Elijah added, handing us 2 more iron talismans and a small lantern filled with oil that smelled faintly of herbs and metal. "Where do we start?" Dad asked. Elijah gestured toward one of the larger sinkholes near Shadow Hollow Campground, the same one where Mom had disappeared. "They'll be waiting for you," he warned. We returned to the campground just as dusk began to settle over the valley, painting everything in shades of gold and gray. The sinkhole loomed ahead of us, like an open mouth waiting to swallow us whole. Dad lit the lantern Elijah had given us and handed me one of the iron talismans. "Stay close," he said firmly, as we approached the edge of the hole. The ground felt soft beneath our feet. Too soft, and I could hear faint whispers rising from below. "Lisa," it was Michael's voice again. I swallowed hard and gripped Dad's hand tightly as we stepped into the sinkhole together. The descent was slow and terrifying, the walls of the hole closing in around us as we climbed down into darkness, lit only by our flickering lantern. And then we reached it. An underground chamber so vast it seemed impossible that something like this could exist beneath our feet without anyone knowing about it. The walls were lined with shadows, not carvings or drawings, but actual shadows moving independently of any light source, and in the center of the chamber stood a crystalline structure glowing faintly with an eerie blue light. Inside that structure was Michael. The chamber was massive, far larger than I could have imagined. The air was thick and cold, and the faint blue glow from the crystalline structure made everything feel unreal. Shadows clung to the walls, writhing and shifting like living things. They weren't natural. They moved as if they had minds of their own, stretching and curling toward us like they wanted to pull us in. "Michael," I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavern. He was inside the glowing structure, suspended in midair. His body looked limp, but his eyes were open, wide and terrified. His shadow wasn't beneath him anymore. It was stretched out, thin and fragile, being pulled into the crystal like threads of smoke. Dad grabbed my arm. "Stay close," he said, his voice shaking but firm. He held the lantern high, and the iron talisman around his neck glinted in the dim light. As we stepped closer to the crystal, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just another shadow on the wall, but then it detached itself and slithered across the ground toward us. "Dad," I whispered, pointing at it. He turned just as the shadow rose up, forming into a shape that looked almost human, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its head too smooth. It had no face, just a blank surface where its features should have been. One by one, more shadows peeled themselves off the walls and began to take shape around us. They moved slowly at first, but as they grew closer, their movements became sharper and more deliberate. The Hollow Men, Dad muttered under his breath. I clutched my iron talisman tightly as one of them reached for me. The moment its shadowy hand touched the edge of the talisman, it recoiled with a hiss, its form rippling like water disturbed by a stone. "They don't like iron," Dad said quickly. "Keep it close." We edged closer to the crystal where Michael was trapped. The glow grew brighter as we approached, and I could feel a strange energy pulsing through the air, a low hum that vibrated in my chest. "Michael," Dad called out. "Can you hear me?" Michael's eyes flicked toward us, but he didn't say anything. His lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. "We have to get him out of there," I said urgently. Dad nodded and set the lantern down on the ground. He reached out toward the crystal cautiously, but before he could touch it, one of the hollow men lunged at him from behind. "Dad!" I screamed. He turned just in time to swing his flashlight at the creature. The beam of light passed through it harmlessly, but when he struck it with the metal casing of the flashlight itself, the creature let out a horrible screech and dissolved into smoke. "They're weak against light reflected through iron," Dad said breathlessly. That's what Elijah meant. I grabbed a metal camping mirror from my backpack. It was small but shiny enough to reflect light, and held it up to catch the glow from our lantern. When I angled it toward one of the hollow men creeping toward us, it shrieked and backed away into the shadows. "We can hold them off," Dad said. "But we have to figure out how to break this thing." I looked at Michael again, at his shadow being drained into the crystal, and remembered what Elijah had said about restoring the seal. "The seal," I said suddenly. "It's him. They're using Michael as part of their ritual." Dad's face went pale as he realized what I meant. "They need his shadow to break free completely." I nodded. "If we can stop them from taking it, maybe we can trap them again." But before we could do anything else, a deep rumbling sound filled the chamber. The ground beneath us shook violently, and cracks began to spread through the walls and floor. From those cracks emerged more shadows, hundreds of them, swarming toward us like a living tide. The rumbling grew louder, and the shadows poured out of the cracks like water flooding a room. They twisted and stretched, forming into more of those faceless figures, the hollow men. There were so many of them now, their blank heads turning toward us in unison. My chest tightened as they moved closer, their long, smoky limbs reaching for us. "Lisa, stay behind me," Dad shouted, grabbing the lantern and holding it high. The light from the lantern flickered across the cavern, and the hollow men hesitated for a moment, shrinking back from its glow. But they didn't stop. They kept coming, slower now, but relentless. I clutched my iron talisman and held up the small mirror I'd taken from my backpack. Angling it toward the lantern's light, I directed a beam at one of the creatures. The light hit it square in the chest, and it let out a horrible screech before dissolving into smoke. "It's working," I yelled. Dad nodded, swinging his flashlight like a weapon as another shadow lunged at him. The metal casing struck its arm, and it recoiled with a hiss before melting into nothingness. But for every one we drove back, more seemed to emerge from the cracks in the ground. They were everywhere now, surrounding us on all sides. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the mirror. "We can't keep this up," Dad said through gritted teeth. "We need to stop them at the source." I turned my eyes back to Michael. He was still trapped inside the glowing crystal, his shadow stretched impossibly thin as it was pulled into the structure. His lips moved again. This time I could just barely make out what he was saying. "Help me. We have to break that thing," I said urgently. "It's their anchor. It's how they're draining him." Dad hesitated for a split second before nodding. "Stay close to me," he said. We pushed forward together, using the lantern and mirror to drive back the hollow men as we made our way toward the crystal. The closer we got, the stronger that strange energy in the air became. It felt like static electricity crawling across my skin. When we reached the base of the crystal, Dad raised his flashlight and brought it down hard against its surface. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, but the crystal didn't crack. It didn't even scratch. "It's too strong," Dad said in frustration. I looked around desperately, searching for anything that might help us. That's when I noticed something carved into the floor near the crystal, a circle filled with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the blue light. The seal, I whispered. What? Dad asked. It's part of the seal, I said quickly. If we can restore it, maybe we can stop them. Dad knelt down beside me, studying the symbols. How do we restore it? He asked. I thought about what Elijah had said. The seal requires a sacrifice, a willing soul to bind it. My stomach dropped as I realized what that meant. Dad, I began, my voice trembling. He looked at me sharply, his eyes narrowing as he understood what I was about to say. No, he said firmly. We'll find another way. There isn't another way, I said quietly. If we don't do this, they'll take Michael's shadow, and then they'll take ours. Before he could argue further, another wave of hollow men surged toward us. Dad stood up quickly, swinging his flashlight to keep them at bay. Lisa, he said without looking at me, stay behind me. But I didn't listen. While Dad fought off the shadows, I reached out and touched one of the glowing symbols on the floor. The moment my fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy shot through me, cold and sharp like ice water rushing through my veins. The shadows froze in place for a moment, their blank heads turning toward me, as if they could sense what I was doing. Lisa, Dad shouted when he realized what was happening. Don't. I have to, I said through gritted teeth as tears streamed down my face. It's the only way. I pressed my hand harder against the symbol, and suddenly everything around me changed. The moment my hand touched the glowing symbol, the cavern seemed to shift around me. The air grew colder, and the shadows froze in place, their heads turning toward me, like they were waiting. I felt a strange pull, like something deep within the earth was reaching for me. Lisa, stop, Dad shouted, his voice breaking. He grabbed my arm and tried to pull me away, but I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I have to do this, I said. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to keep going. It's the only way to save Michael and Mom. Dad's grip tightened, his face pale and desperate. We'll find another way, he said, his voice cracking. Please, there isn't another way, I whispered. You know that. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes filled with pain. Then he let go of my arm and stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I turned back to the seal and pressed both hands against it. The symbols flared brighter, and the energy surged through me again, stronger this time, almost overwhelming. My shadow began to flicker on the ground beneath me, growing thinner and fainter with each passing second. The hollow men moved closer now, their blank faces tilted toward me, as if they could sense what was happening. But they didn't attack. They just stood there, watching. The crystal holding Michael began to crack. Thin lines spread across its surface like spider webs, and the glow inside it dimmed. Michael's shadow stopped stretching. It started to return to him. Lisa, I heard him whisper faintly. I smiled through my tears as I saw his body slump forward in relief inside the crystal. But then I felt it, the pull growing stronger. My shadow stretched out across the floor, twisting into the glowing symbols of the seal. The energy wrapped around me like icy vines, pulling me down toward the earth. Lisa, Dad screamed. I turned to look at him one last time. Take care of Michael, I said softly, and tell Mom, I love her. No, Dad shouted, running toward me. But it was too late. The ground beneath me opened up like a mouth, and I felt myself sinking into it. My shadow spread across the seal, filling in the cracks and restoring its glow. The hollow men let out horrible screeches as they dissolved into smoke, their forms melting away into nothingness. The cavern began to shake violently as the seal reactivated. The shadows on the walls disappeared one by one, pulled back into the earth where they belonged. And then, everything went still. When I woke up, or maybe it wasn't waking up, I found myself standing in a place that felt both familiar and strange. The walls were smooth stone, and faint blue light glowed all around me. My shadow was gone. I couldn't see it anywhere, but I didn't feel afraid anymore. I knew what had happened. I had become part of the seal. My soul was tied to this place now, keeping the hollow men trapped beneath the earth where they couldn't hurt anyone else. I thought about Dad and Michael and Mom. Would they be okay? Would they understand why I had done this? Somehow, I knew they would. 20 years passed before anyone returned to Shadow Hollow Campground. By then, our RV had become a sort of monument, a rusted relic sitting above an old sinkhole that had long since been filled in. Lisa Patterson, my name was carved into a plaque beside it with a simple inscription. Bullage, she gave everything to save her family. Asterisk Michael came back once as an adult in 1975. He stood there for hours, staring at the RV with tears in his eyes. He didn't go inside, no one ever did, but he swore he could hear whispers coming from within, and if you looked closely through the windows, you could see shadows moving inside. My name is Frank Dawson. I'm 46 years old and I used to be a forest ranger. Now I sell insurance. It's not exactly the life I imagined for myself, but things changed 5 years ago, changed in ways I can't fix. My wife Marilyn and I lost our son, David. He drowned while we were on a family camping trip. I was supposed to be watching him, but I wasn't paying attention. Marilyn hasn't forgiven me. Honestly, I haven't forgiven myself either. She says she doesn't blame me outright, but her eyes tell a different story every time she looks at me. We've been trying to piece things back together ever since, but it's like walking on broken glass. Our marriage counselor suggested we take a trip back to nature where we used to be happy before everything fell apart. That's how we ended up here. In Willow Creek, Northern California. It's supposed to be beautiful, towering redwoods, fresh air, and quiet trails. But as we drove deeper into the forest in our old 1972 Winnebago Brave RV, the silence started feeling less peaceful and more heavy. We were headed for Solitude Campground, a fitting name, but halfway there, a massive tree had fallen across the road. There was no way around it, so we had to take an unmarked detour down an abandoned logging road. The RV rattled and groaned as the dirt path got rougher and narrower. Marilyn sat quietly beside me, staring out the window like she was somewhere far away. Then it happened. The RV broke down. The engine sputtered once, twice, then died completely. I tried restarting it, but nothing worked. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and no way to call for help. Great. Marilyn muttered under her breath, her tone sharp enough to cut through steel. I stepped out to check the engine and stretch my legs. That's when I noticed them. Footprints in the dirt near the edge of the forest. They were huge, at least 18 inches long, and spaced far apart like whoever or whatever made them had an enormous stride. Frank, Marilyn called from inside the RV. What's taking so long? Nothing, I said quickly, brushing off what I'd seen. Just trying to figure this out. But those footprints stayed in my mind as we set up camp near the RV that evening. Something about them didn't feel right. Not just their size, but their shape too. They weren't human. Not entirely. That night, the forest felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The air was still, but it wasn't quiet. There were sounds, soft rustling, distant snaps of twigs, and something else, something faint but unsettling. Marilyn stayed inside the RV, reading one of her books by the dim light of a lantern. I sat outside by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to push away the uneasiness creeping into my chest. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, like it was carried on the wind. "Daddy, I'm cold." I froze. My heart stopped for a moment, then started pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It was David's voice, my son's voice, but it couldn't be. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep in the woods. "Daddy, help me." I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me, and stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. "David," I called out instinctively, my voice cracking. Marilyn appeared in the doorway of the RV, her face pale and confused. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded slowly, unable to speak. She stepped outside and stood beside me, clutching her book tightly against her chest like it was some kind of shield. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's David." "No," I said firmly, though my own voice didn't sound convincing even to me. "It's not possible." We stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the faint echoes of our son's voice calling out to us from different directions, first from the left, then from behind us, then from somewhere far ahead in the woods. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, or how far away it was. Marilyn wanted to go after him. I could see it in her eyes, but I stopped her before she could take a single step toward the trees. "It's not him," I said again, gripping her arm tightly. "It can't be." She pulled away from me angrily and stormed back into the RV without another word. I stayed outside a little longer, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I noticed something strange near the edge of our campsite. Tufts of hair caught on a broken branch. The hair was coarse and dark brown, almost black, and there was a lot of it scattered around like something big had brushed against the trees nearby. I didn't tell Marilyn about it when I went back inside. She was already upset enough, as it was. Instead, I locked the RV door and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine in the morning. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, the forest felt different. It wasn't just the usual stillness of the woods. It was heavier, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Marilyn barely spoke to me as we ate a quiet breakfast of canned beans and toast. She kept glancing toward the woods, her face pale and drawn. I knew what she was thinking because I was thinking it too. After we ate, I decided to take another look at the RV's engine. Maybe I'd missed something last night in the dark. Marilyn stayed inside, flipping through an old photo album she'd brought with her, pictures of David smiling, laughing, playing in the backyard. I could hear her sniffling quietly as I worked outside. That's when it happened again. At first, it was faint, just a soft crackle of static coming from the RV's old radio. I didn't think much of it until I heard the sound of a child's laughter cutting through the static. It was light and playful, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Frank." Marilyn called from inside, her voice sharp with panic. I ran back into the RV and saw her standing frozen in front of the radio, her hands trembling as she pointed at it. "Listen," she whispered. The laughter came again, clearer this time, followed by a voice that made my stomach drop. "Mommy. Daddy. Where are you?" It was David's voice again, but this time it sounded closer, too close. Marilyn burst into tears and dropped into one of the RV's worn-out seats, covering her face with her hands. "It's him," she sobbed. "I know it's him." "No," I said firmly, though my own fear was bubbling just beneath the surface. "It's not possible." She didn't respond, just kept crying softly as I turned off the radio and stepped outside to clear my head. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt leading away from our campsite and into the woods. But these weren't like the ones I'd seen yesterday. These were smaller, much smaller, like they belonged to a child or someone wearing a child's shoes. I followed them for a few steps before stopping myself. Something about them felt wrong, not just their size but their placement too. They were too perfect, too deliberate, like they'd been left there on purpose for someone to find. "Frank." A voice called out from behind me, startling me so badly that I nearly tripped over my own feet. I turned around to see an older man standing near our campsite with a hiking pack slung over one shoulder. He looked weathered and tired but alert, his eyes scanning the trees like he was expecting something to jump out at any moment. "Sorry to scare you," he said quickly, when he saw my expression. "Name's Thomas Reeves." He gestured toward the woods with his thumb. "I've been hiking these trails for years, but you shouldn't be here." "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. He glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "There have been stories about this area, families disappearing after hearing voices in the woods, voices that sound like people they've lost." He paused for a moment before adding quietly, "It's not safe." I wanted to dismiss him as some crazy old hiker with too many campfire stories under his belt, but something about his tone made me believe him, or at least made me want to listen. Before I could respond, Marilyn stepped out of the RV behind me, her face streaked with tears but full of determination. I heard him. she said firmly, looking directly at Thomas like she didn't care who he was or what he thought. I heard my son. Thomas sighed heavily and shook his head. If you did, he said grimly, then you need to leave, now. That night, the forest seemed darker than before. The fire we built barely lit up the clearing around us, and the shadows between the trees felt alive, shifting and stretching like they were watching us. Marilyn stayed inside the RV, refusing to come out. She hadn't said much since Thomas's warning earlier in the day, but I could tell she was still holding on to the idea that David was out there waiting for us. Thomas had set up his small tent not far from our RV. He said he'd stay close for the night, just in case. I didn't know what just in case meant exactly, but having someone else nearby made me feel a little less alone. Around midnight, I heard it again, David's voice. Daddy, help me. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Then it grew louder, closer. Daddy, where are you? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Marilyn must have heard it too because she came rushing out of the RV, her face pale and her eyes wide with hope and fear. It's him, she whispered, clutching my arm tightly. Frank, it's him. No, I said firmly, trying to keep her from running into the trees. It's not him, Marilyn. You know it's not. But she pulled away from me, tears streaming down her face. You don't know that, she snapped. What if he's out there? What if he needs us? Before I could stop her, Thomas appeared out of the shadows with a flashlight in hand. Don't, he said sharply, stepping between Marilyn and the woods. Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not real. Marilyn glared at him but didn't move any closer to the trees. I could see her hands trembling as she hugged herself tightly. Then we heard something else. A scream. It was loud and raw, and filled with so much pain that it made my blood run cold. It wasn't David's voice this time. It was Thomas's. We all turned toward his campsite just as the scream was cut off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward his tent while Marilyn shouted after me to stop. When I reached his campsite, my stomach dropped. His tent was torn open like something massive had ripped through it in one swipe. His belongings were scattered everywhere, his flashlight still rolling on the ground, but there was no sign of him. Then I heard it. Thomas's voice calling out from deeper in the woods. Help me, please. But something about it wasn't right. It sounded off somehow, like someone trying too hard to sound like him. I backed away slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the trees around me. That's when I saw movement, a shadowy figure darting between the trunks just beyond the edge of my light. I ran back to the RV as fast as I could, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it tight. What happened? Marilyn asked frantically. I didn't answer her. I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd seen or heard. Instead, I grabbed a knife from one of the drawers and sat by the door, listening to the sounds outside. For hours we sat there in silence except for one thing, Thomas's voice circling our RV. Help me. Let me in. Please. It came from every direction, first from one side of the RV then another, and each time it sounded more desperate than before. But deep down I knew it wasn't him anymore. When the sun finally rose, the forest didn't feel any safer. If anything, the daylight made everything worse. The shadows were gone, but the silence was overwhelming. Marilyn sat by the RV window, staring out at the woods with red, puffy eyes. She hadn't slept at all, and neither had I. I need to find Thomas, I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. Marilyn didn't respond. She just kept staring out the window like she was waiting for something or someone to appear. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and stepped outside, my legs stiff from sitting all night. The campsite felt eerily still, like the world had stopped moving entirely. I walked toward Thomas's tent, hoping, praying that maybe he'd come back during the night. But when I reached his campsite, I knew there was no hope left. Thomas was there, or at least what was left of him. His body was torn apart, scattered across the ground like something had ripped him to pieces. His face was frozen in a look of pure terror, and his throat was empty. His vocal cords were gone, like they'd been surgically removed. I stumbled backward, gagging as the smell hit me. My hands shook so badly that I dropped my flashlight and it rolled into a patch of blood-soaked dirt. "Frank?" Marilyn's voice called from behind me. I turned quickly to see her standing a few feet away, her face pale and horrified as she looked past me at Thomas's remains. "Go back to the RV," I said firmly, trying to block her view. "Now." She didn't argue. She just turned and walked away without saying another word. I stayed there for a few minutes longer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't an animal attack. There was no way this kind of precision came from claws or teeth. Whatever did this, it wasn't natural. When I finally returned to the RV, Marilyn was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "We need to leave," she whispered. "I know," I said quietly, "but the RV's engine is still dead." She shook her head and pointed toward the dashboard radio. "It's not just the engine," she said shakily. Something took parts out of it." I frowned and walked over to inspect it myself. Sure enough, several key components were missing, things that couldn't have just fallen out or broken on their own. "Who would do this?" Marilyn asked softly. I didn't answer her because I didn't know, but deep down, I had a feeling it wasn't a who we were dealing with. It was a what. As we sat there in silence, the radio crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't laughter or static. It was David's voice. "Mommy, Daddy, don't leave me." Marilyn broke down completely, sobbing into her hands as the voice repeated itself over and over again. I wanted to tell her it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, but even I wasn't sure anymore. That night, Marilyn refused to leave the RV. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, clutching one of David's old sweaters like it was the only thing keeping her together. I didn't blame her. I felt the same way, like everything around us was falling apart, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I stepped outside to clear my head, even though every instinct told me to stay locked inside. The fire pit had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the clearing. I stared into the woods, trying to convince myself that this was all just a bad dream, that I'd wake up any second and Marilyn would be smiling again, and David would still be alive. But then I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, gripping the flashlight tightly in my hand. It was Alice Warner, the park ranger we'd met briefly when we first arrived in Willow Creek. She looked different now, tired, scared, and carrying a shotgun slung over her shoulder. "You shouldn't be here," she said bluntly, her voice low and urgent. "I know," I replied, "but we're stuck." She nodded grimly and gestured toward the woods. "There's something out there," she said. "Something that's been here for a long time." "What is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Alice hesitated before speaking again. "It's called the Voice Collector," she said quietly. "There've been stories about it for over a century. Families disappearing after hearing voices in the woods, voices of people they've lost." I felt my stomach drop as her words sank in. "What does it want?" I asked. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "It collects voices," she said simply. "It uses them to lure people in, to make them think their loved ones are still alive." I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to think this was all some elaborate hoax or misunderstanding, but deep down I knew she was telling the truth. "Where does it keep them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alice pointed toward the woods with a shaky hand. "There's a cave," she said. "I found it once while hiking years ago, but I didn't go inside." She paused before adding, "You don't want to see what's in there." I glanced back at the RV where Marilyn was still sitting silently inside. Her face was pale and blank, like she'd given up completely. "I have to find it," I said firmly. Alice stared at me for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "I'll show you," she said, "but you need to be ready for what you'll see." We walked through the woods in silence, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as the trees closed in around us. The air felt colder here, heavier somehow, like we were being watched from every direction. When we reached the cave, Alice stopped abruptly and pointed toward its entrance, a jagged hole in the side of a rocky hill covered in moss and vines. "This is it," she said quietly. I stepped inside without hesitation, even though every part of me was screaming to turn back. The air inside smelled damp and rotten, like something had been decaying here for years. Then I saw them, dozens of vocal cords preserved in tree sap hanging from the walls like grotesque trophies. Each one seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were still alive somehow, still holding on to their last screams or whispers. I felt sick, sicker than I'd ever felt in my life, but I couldn't look away. "Frank?" Alice's voice called from outside the cave. I turned back toward her just as Marilyn's voice echoed through the woods. "Frank, help me." Alice grabbed my arm tightly before I could run toward it. "It's not her," she hissed urgently. "Don't fall for it." But when I turned back toward the RV's direction, Marilyn was already gone, her footprints leading deeper into the forest. I didn't think, I just ran. Marilyn's voice was calling out from somewhere deep in the woods, and even though Alice had warned me, I couldn't stop myself. What if it really was her? What if she needed me? The flashlight beam bounced wildly as I sprinted through the trees, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Frank," her voice cried again, sounding desperate and scared. "Please, help me." Alice was right behind me, shouting for me to stop. "It's not her, Frank. It's a trap." But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Not until I found her. The footprints in the dirt were fresh, small, and hurried, like Marilyn had been running. They led me to a clearing surrounded by towering redwoods, their branches arching overhead like a cathedral of shadows. In the center of the clearing was something that made my blood run cold, a strange rock formation that looked like a throne, and around it were items arranged in a careful circle: shoes, backpacks, watches, even children's toys. I recognized some of them immediately. One of the items was David's favorite toy truck, the one he'd been holding the day he drowned. Alice caught up to me and grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "We have to go," she said urgently. "It's close." Before I could respond, a scream tore through the air, Marilyn's scream. It was raw and filled with so much pain that it made my chest tighten. Without thinking, I broke free from Alice's grip and ran toward the sound. "Frank, stop!" Alice shouted after me, but her voice was quickly drowned out by the forest itself, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and something heavy moving through the trees. When I finally found Marilyn, she was standing in another clearing, her back to me. She wasn't moving, just standing there completely still like she was in some kind of trance. "Marilyn," I called out as I ran toward her. She turned slowly to face me, and what I saw made my heart drop. Her eyes were wide and empty, her face pale as if all the life had been drained out of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, just a faint gurgling noise like she was choking on something invisible. Then I felt it, the presence behind me. I turned around slowly, and there it was. The voice collector. It wasn't human, not even close. It stood at least 8 feet tall with long arms that ended in clawed hands. Its body was covered in matted fur that seemed to shift and ripple like shadows on water. But its face was the worst part. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to stare straight into my soul, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged teeth that glistened in the moonlight. And then it spoke, not with its own voice, but with dozens of voices, men, women, children, all speaking at once in a horrifying chorus. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze in terror as it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it knew there was no escape. Alice appeared out of nowhere, firing her shotgun at the creature without hesitation. The blast echoed through the forest, and the creature let out an ear-piercing screech before disappearing into the shadows. "Get up!" Alice shouted at me as she grabbed Marilyn's arm and started pulling her away. I stumbled to my feet and followed them back toward the RV as fast as I could, but I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. We made it back to the RV just as the last light of day faded behind the trees. Marilyn was barely able to walk, her body limp and her eyes still blank, like she wasn't fully there anymore. Alice and I helped her inside and locked the door behind us. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice shaking. "It'll come back." Alice nodded, her face pale but determined. "It's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." "What does it want?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated before replying. "It wants her voice," she said quietly, nodding toward Marilyn. "And maybe yours too." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The thought of that thing taking Marilyn's voice, her life, was unbearable. I had to do something. As night fell, the forest around us came alive with sound, not the usual chirping of crickets or rustling leaves, but voices, dozens of them. They came from every direction, calling out to us in familiar tones. David's voice, Thomas's voice, even my own mother's voice from years ago. "Frank, come outside." "Marilyn, we're waiting for you." "Help me, please." The voices grew louder and more insistent, circling the RV like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Marilyn sat in the corner, covering her ears and rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. "It's not real," I whispered to her, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "Don't listen to them." Then the RV started shaking violently, like something massive was pushing against it from all sides. The windows rattled, and the lights flickered as a low growl echoed through the air. "It's here," Alice said grimly, gripping her shotgun tightly. The growling stopped suddenly, replaced by a deafening silence that made my ears ring, and then we heard it, a soft tapping on the RV door. "Daddy, it's me," David's voice said from outside. "Please, let me in." Marilyn bolted upright, her eyes wide with desperation. "It's him," she cried, trying to get to the door. I grabbed her before she could open it, holding her back with all my strength. "It's not him," I shouted. "You know it's not." She struggled against me for a moment before collapsing into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The tapping stopped, and for a brief moment, everything went quiet again. Then the door burst open. The voice collector stood in the doorway, its massive frame filling the entrance as its hollow eyes stared directly at us. It didn't move at first, just stood there silently, as if studying us. Then it spoke again, using David's voice. "Mommy, don't you love me?" Marilyn screamed and clutched at her throat as if she couldn't breathe. The creature stepped inside slowly, its claws reaching out toward her. "Get away from her," I shouted, grabbing a can of lighter fluid from the counter and spraying it at the creature's face. Alice didn't waste a second. She lit a match and threw it at the creature just as the fluid soaked into its fur. The flames erupted instantly, engulfing the creature in a fiery blaze. It let out an unearthly screech that shook the entire RV before stumbling backward out the door and into the woods. For a moment, everything was still except for the sound of crackling flames in the distance. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The forest was eerily quiet after the creature fled into the night. Marilyn was trembling in my arms, her breathing shallow and uneven. Alice stood by the door, her shotgun still aimed at the darkness outside, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. "We need to leave," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." Alice nodded. "If we stay here, it'll come back." I helped Marilyn into one of the RV seats and quickly started rummaging through the engine compartment. The RV was still missing parts, but I had an idea. My military training from years ago came rushing back to me. If I could hotwire the engine, we might have a chance. My hands were shaking as I worked, twisting wires together and praying it would work. Every second felt like an eternity, and every rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. Marilyn sat silently, staring blankly out the window as if she were in a trance. Finally, the engine sputtered to life. Relief washed over me like a wave, but it was short-lived. As I climbed back into the driver's seat and shifted into gear, I heard something, a faint sound coming from underneath the RV. It was David's voice again.
Daddy, I'm here.
My blood ran cold. Alice's eyes widened as she looked at me. "It's under us," she whispered. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the RV lurched forward down the narrow dirt road. The tires kicked up dirt and rocks as we sped through the forest, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that had settled overnight. But the voice didn't stop. "Daddy, slow down. You're going to hurt me." It was coming from inside the engine now, echoing through the vents like it was crawling through the RV itself. Marilyn suddenly screamed and pointed at the dashboard radio. It had turned on by itself, and David's voice was coming through loud and clear. "Mommy, why are you leaving me?" The RV swerved as I struggled to keep my focus on the road. Alice grabbed Marilyn before she could reach for the radio and pulled her back into her seat. "Don't listen to it," Alice shouted over the sound of David's voice. But it wasn't just David anymore. The voices multiplied. Thomas's voice, my mother's voice, even random voices I didn't recognize, all speaking at once in a horrifying chorus. "You can't escape, you belong to us." The RV shook violently as if something massive was clawing at its underside. The steering wheel jerked in my hands, and I realized with growing terror that we weren't going to make it far like this. Then I saw it, the creature in the rearview mirror. It was clinging to the back of the RV, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its mouth moved as it mimicked David's voice perfectly.
She.
"Stop running." I knew what I had to do. "Take Marilyn," I said to Alice, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "What?" Alice shouted, her face filled with confusion and panic. "Take her and run," I repeated firmly. "I'll distract it." "No," Marilyn screamed, snapping out of her daze for the first time all night. "Frank, don't do this." I looked at her, tears welling up in my eyes. "I have to," I said softly. "It won't stop unless someone stops it." Before she could argue, I slammed on the brakes, sending Marilyn and Alice tumbling forward in their seats. The creature flew off the back of the RV and landed hard on the ground behind us. "Go," I shouted as I jumped out of the driver's seat and grabbed a flare from one of our emergency kits. Alice hesitated for only a moment before grabbing Marilyn and pulling her out of the RV through the passenger door. They disappeared into the woods as I turned to face the voice collector. It rose slowly from where it had fallen, its hollow eyes locking onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It didn't speak this time, just growled low in its throat as it stepped closer. I lit the flare and held it out in front of me like a shield. "Oh, you want me?" I said through gritted teeth. "Come and get me." The creature lunged at me with terrifying speed, its claws swiping inches from my face as I dodged to the side. I swung wildly with the flare, hitting its arm and sending sparks flying into its fur. It howled in pain but didn't stop. It never stopped. As it closed in on me again, I threw myself toward its legs, tackling it to the ground with every ounce of strength I had left. The flare rolled out of my hand as we struggled on the forest floor, its light casting eerie shadows across our fight. In that moment, I knew there was no way out for me. But if Marilyn could escape, if she could live, then it would all be worth it. Weeks later, Marilyn sat alone in a small apartment far from Willow Creek. Her vocal cords were damaged. She couldn't speak anymore, but she didn't care about that now. She spent her days warning anyone who would listen, writing notes to hikers about staying away from those woods. But late at night, when everything was quiet, she would hear his voice again. "Marilyn." Frank's voice called softly from somewhere inside her apartment. "I'm home." Her hands trembled as she clutched David's sweater tightly against her chest. She knew it wasn't him, but deep down, part of her wanted to believe it was.